For 8 years, I stood just outside the frame of every photograph my husband's family ever took. I want you to picture that literally, because it happened literally. At Christmas mornings, at anniversary parties, at the annual company holiday portrait taken in front of the fireplace at the family estate, I was, every single time, asked with some version of the same casual phrase to hop out for just this one, dear, family only. While my husband, my children, his siblings, his parents, even his cousins' new spouses of a single year stood inside the frame smiling for the camera. My name is Camille. This is the story of 8 years spent as the woman who wasn't quite family, and the single signature that finally forced everyone to admit exactly how wrong they'd been about what that word meant. I met my husband, Julian, at a mutual friend's engagement party, back when I was 29 and working as a corporate accountant at a firm downtown. Julian was warm, funny, refreshingly unimpressed with the kind of status games that seemed to matter so much to everyone else in his social circle, which I would later understand was ironic, given exactly how much status mattered to the family he came from. He never once, in our entire courtship, mentioned that his family owned Hartwell Manufacturing, a mid-sized industrial company his grandfather had founded 70 years earlier, and that his father, Whitfield Hartwell, now ran with the particular blend of pride and paranoia common to men who've spent their whole lives protecting something they didn't build themselves. I found out about the family business almost by accident, 3 months into dating Julian, when I recognized the Hartwell name on an invoice crossing my desk at work. An unrelated coincidence, our firm audited a supplier that did business with them. When I mentioned it to Julian that evening, slightly stunned, he shrugged and said, "Yeah, that's my family. I don't really talk about it much. It's a whole thing." I would come to understand, over the following 8 years, exactly how much of a whole thing it was. Whitfield Hartwell was, from the very first dinner I had with the family, a man who evaluated people the way he evaluated suppliers, for utility, for pedigree, for whether they added value to the Hartwell name or merely took from it. His wife Margot was softer in manner, but no less exacting in her judgments. The kind of woman who could deliver a devastating assessment of your outfit, your career, or your family background using nothing but a warm smile and a slightly too long pause before responding. Julian's 2 older siblings, Beatrice and Whitfield Jr., had both married what the family considered appropriate partners. People from old money families, people whose last names meant something at the country club, people who had grown up, as Margot liked to put it, understanding how things work. I had grown up the daughter of a public school teacher and an electrician. I understood, from the very first dinner, exactly which category I fell into. The exclusion started small enough that I spent the first 2 years genuinely wondering if I was imagining it. At our engagement dinner, when the photographer gathered the family for a formal portrait, Margot touched my elbow gently and said, "This one's just close family, sweetheart. We'll get you and Julian separately after." I stood to the side, smiling, telling myself it was a minor oversight, that these things happen at big family events, that I shouldn't read too much into a single photograph. It was not a single photograph. It became, over the following months and years, a pattern so consistent it might as well have been written into a family bylaw. Every Christmas morning photo, taken in front of the Hartwell estate's enormous fireplace, a tradition dating back decades, featured Whitfield, Margot, Beatrice, and her husband, Whitfield Jr. and his wife, and eventually all of their children, but never me. Every year, some version of the same soft dismissal. Let's just do the family line this year. We'll get individual shots after. A promise that was kept perhaps twice in 8 years, and even then, always as an obvious afterthought, taken separately on a different wall, with visibly different lighting. The company's annual holiday portrait, a formal photograph taken each December for the corporate newsletter and the lobby display at Hartwell Manufacturing's headquarters, featuring the Hartwell family standing in front of the fireplace at the estate, never once, in 8 years, included me. Not the year I was 6 months pregnant with our first child, standing awkwardly at the edge of the room while the photographer arranged everyone else. Not the year Julian was named Vice President of Operations, a milestone that warranted an especially large portrait, prominently displayed, that showed his entire, immediate family, his parents, his siblings, and their spouses, but not his own wife. I confronted Julian about it more times than I can count over those years. And I want to be honest about his response because I think it matters for understanding how this situation persisted as long as it did. Julian was never cruel about it. He was, in a way that frustrated me more than cruelty would have, endlessly, exhaustingly reasonable. "It's just my mom's thing with the photos. It doesn't mean anything," he'd say. Or, "You know how she is about tradition, it's not personal." Or, most maddeningly, "I'll talk to her," followed every single time by nothing changing whatsoever. I stayed through those 8 years for reasons that I think will be familiar to anyone who has ever loved someone whose family made them feel small. I stayed because Julian, away from his family, was genuinely the man I'd fallen in love with. Attentive, funny, a wonderful father to our 2 children. I stayed because I told myself year after year that the photograph thing was petty and beneath my attention, that I shouldn't let a piece of paper with images on it define my sense of belonging. I stayed because leaving would have meant uprooting my children from a family, however flawed, that loved them, even if it consistently failed to fully see me. What I did not do during those 8 years was disappear professionally the way the Hartwells seemed to assume I would. I kept working, moved from corporate accounting into forensic accounting, a specialty I'd developed a genuine passion for. Untangling complicated financial structures, tracing ownership through layers of holding companies and trusts, the kind of detail-oriented work that suited a mind that had spent years quietly cataloging every small slight without ever losing track of a single one. I built a solid, respected career entirely separate from the Hartwell name, a fact that Margot occasionally mentioned at dinner parties with a faint note of surprise, as though she hadn't quite expected me to amount to much of anything on my own. The moment everything changed began, unglamorously, with a routine estate planning update. Whitfield Hartwell, approaching 70 and increasingly concerned with the long-term structure of the company he intended to pass to his children, had spent the previous 2 years working with estate attorneys to restructure Hartwell Manufacturing's ownership ahead of an eventual transition. Julian, as Vice President of Operations and the child most actively involved in day-to-day management, had been named a significant shareholder in this restructuring, a fact I knew because Julian had mentioned it, though neither of us had paid especially close attention to the fine print of exactly how his shares were structured, since we'd trusted the family's longtime attorney to handle the details appropriately. What none of us fully understood at the time, what Whitfield himself, I would later learn, had genuinely overlooked in the complexity of the restructuring, was that under the specific type of trust his attorney had used to transfer Julian's shares, Spousal co-signature was required for any transaction involving those shares above a certain threshold. A standard boilerplate protection meant to prevent exactly the kind of unilateral asset stripping that sometimes happens in family business disputes. In plain terms, anytime Hartwell Manufacturing needed to leverage, sell, or restructure debt against the portion of the company Julian owned, my signature, as his spouse, was legally required alongside his. Nobody at that family dinner table, across 8 years of photographs I wasn't included in, had ever imagined this detail would matter. I don't think Whitfield had even fully registered it existed. It sat there, quietly, in a stack of legal paperwork for nearly 2 years, doing nothing, mattering to no one, until Hartwell Manufacturing ran into serious trouble. The trouble arrived in the form of a critical supplier contract falling through, combined with a factory equipment failure that required immediate, expensive replacement, combined with a banking relationship that had soured after Whitfield Jr. Managing the company's finances with more confidence than competence missed 2 consecutive loan covenant deadlines. By the time I learned any of this, from Julian, arriving home unusually late one evening, visibly shaken in a way I'd rarely seen from him, Hartwell Manufacturing was facing a cash crisis serious enough to threaten the company's ability to make payroll within 6 weeks. The solution the family's attorneys proposed involved restructuring a significant portion of the company's debt, using Julian's shares, the shares requiring my signature, as partial collateral for an emergency line of credit. Julian explained all of this to me at our kitchen table, clearly uncomfortable, clearly having been sent by his father to handle what Whitfield apparently considered an unfortunate administrative technicality, rather than anything requiring genuine acknowledgement. "They need you to sign some paperwork," Julian said. "It's just a formality. My dad's attorney has it ready. They just need your signature by Friday." I sat with that sentence for a long moment. 8 years. 8 years of standing outside every photograph, of family-only portraits, of my own children's father, appearing in framed pictures throughout that house and that company's headquarters lobby, without me anywhere in the image. And now, apparently, my signature, my legal participation, my formal recognition as part of this family's financial structure, was needed by Friday, framed as a mere formality by the same people who had spent nearly a decade treating my presence as entirely optional. I did not sign anything that week. I want to be honest that this wasn't initially a calculated strategy. My first reaction was simply hurt, and a kind of stunned clarity about exactly how the Hartwells had always viewed me. I told Julian I needed time to review the paperwork properly, which was true, and which also happened to be something Julian couldn't argue with, given that I was, professionally, a forensic accountant more qualified than most people in that family to actually understand what I was being asked to sign. What I found, reviewing the documents over the following 10 days, with a careful, professional eye I'd built over years of exactly this kind of work, was more significant than I initially expected. The proposed collateral structure would have placed Julian's shares, a substantial portion of the family's ownership stake, at real risk if Hartwell Manufacturing's turnaround efforts failed, which, based on my own analysis of the company's financials that Julian had access to, was a genuine possibility given how the crisis had been mismanaged so far. I was not simply being asked to sign a formality. I was being asked to co-sign a significant financial risk to my own family's future on behalf of people who had spent 8 years demonstrating, photograph after photograph, exactly how little they considered me part of that family in any meaningful sense. I requested a meeting with Whitfield directly, which surprised everyone, including Julian, who had never once in 8 years seen me request to discuss business matters with his father one-on-one. We met in Whitfield's study, the same house where I had stood outside so many photographs over the years. I brought a folder, not unlike the one from other reckonings you may have heard about, though this one contained something different: a professional financial analysis, prepared in my capacity as a forensic accountant, outlining exactly what risks the proposed restructuring posed, and exactly what alternative structures might protect the family's interests, including mine, more effectively. "I've reviewed the paperwork," I told him, sliding the folder across his desk. "I have concerns about the collateral structure, and I've outlined an alternative approach that reduces the risk to Julian's shares while still addressing the cash crisis." Whitfield, to his credit, did not dismiss me outright, though I could see the surprise on his face at being handed a formal financial analysis by the daughter-in-law he'd spent 8 years quietly excluding from his fireplace. He read through it, slowly, and I watched something shift in his expression as he began to understand that the woman sitting across from him was not simply an inconvenient legal signature standing between him and a bank loan, but someone with genuine professional expertise directly relevant to the crisis threatening everything he'd spent his life building. "This is," he said, looking up from the folder. "This is quite thorough." "I'm a forensic accountant," I said. "I've spent 8 years building a career you've never once asked me a single question about. I would have been happy to help with the company's finances long before now, if anyone had ever considered me worth asking. I want to be clear that I did not, in that meeting, refuse to sign the paperwork out of spite. I signed, 3 days later, a revised agreement that incorporated the protective structure I'd recommended, one that ultimately served the family's interests far better than the original proposal would have, a fact that Whitfield's own attorneys confirmed once they reviewed my alternative. But I signed it as a full, informed, professional participant in the decision, not as a formality rushed through by Friday. Something did shift after that, gradually, in the months that followed. It wasn't a dramatic transformation. Margot did not suddenly become warm, and I won't pretend 8 years of exclusion resolved into some tidy sitcom ending. But the following Christmas, when the photographer arrived to take the annual family portrait in front of that same fireplace, Whitfield himself, without prompting, without anyone asking on my behalf, said, "Camille, come stand here, next to Julian," and gestured to the empty space beside my husband that had sat conspicuously empty in 8 years of framed photographs throughout that house. I stood in that photograph. I have a copy of it now, framed in my own home, the first image in 8 years that includes every single member of that family standing together in one frame. I don't display it because I need the validation, particularly. I display it because it reminds me of something I learned slowly, over 8 years of standing just outside so many frames. That belonging isn't something other people get to grant you through inclusion in a photograph. It's something you carry with you regardless, built through your own work, your own competence, your own quiet refusal to disappear simply because you weren't handed a seat at the table. If you've ever spent years being treated as peripheral to a family, a team, a group you had every right to belong to fully, I want you to understand that the validation, when it finally comes, is nice, but it was never actually the point. The point was that you were always exactly as capable, exactly as valuable, exactly as worthy of the frame as everyone standing inside it, whether or not anyone ever bothered to say so out loud. If this story resonated with you, let me know in the comments. Have you ever had to prove your worth to people who should have recognized it all along? Subscribe to Quiet Reckoning for a new story every week.